In today's video, we will be looking at Hyūga, the second of the Ise-class battleships. A ship with a mostly quiet career, outside, of course, of a questionable rebuild. Battle carriers are a fun concept, but in reality, they aren't exactly the best idea. You get a kinda bad aircraft carrier in exchange for a battleship with a massive weak point. Fun in fiction, not so great in reality. Before that, however, let's look at where Hyūga began her life. As designed, the battleship displaced around 30,000 tons at her standard loading. This rose to 37,000 tons at full load. On that displacement, the battleship carried no fewer than 12 356mm or 14-inch guns. These were carried in 3 pairs of super-firing turrets. 1 pair on the bow, 1 pair amidships behind the funnels, and a final pair on the stern. Probably one of the more efficient turret farm layouts, but still a lot of turrets for the amount of firepower. To support the main battery, Hyūga carried 20 140mm or 5.5-inch secondary weapons, 18 of them in single casement mountings, with the final 2 on the deck with gun shields. Further weaponry came in the form of 4 single 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and the traditionally Japanese heavy torpedo battery. 6 21-inch submerged torpedo tubes, to be specific, with 3 on either side. All of this was protected by a main belt of 11.8 inches at its thickest. The deck armor came out to 3.3 inches total, but it was a layered design of multiple thinner armored decks. Not quite as good as a single plate of the same thickness. With all of that covered, that just leaves the speed. Hyūga, as designed, was intended for a speed of 23 knots. This was provided by 45,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. On her sea trials, however, the ship managed to reach 24 knots. As that rounds off the technical bits, let's look at Hyūga's service history now. Laid down on May 6, 1915 in Nagasaki, Hyūga began her construction while the Great War was well underway. Her launch on January 27, 1917, was past the point the Japanese needed her for actual combat duty. Arguably, that was true of when she was laid down as well. The Pacific theater of the Great War was mostly quiet after the first year. In any event, Hyūga's fitting out progressed in fairly typical fashion. The battleship was formally commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy on April 30th, 1918. As could be expected, her initial service was mostly spent on working up. For most ships, there wouldn't be much to note here. Hyūga is not most ships. This is as good a point as any to bring up the fact that she was something of an unlucky ship. Not in the big and flashy kind of way, but in the a lot of little things kind of way. For example, on September 30th, 1918, one of her boats capsized and killed 5 sailors. And a little over a year later, on October 24th, 1919, an explosion in her number 3 turret killed 11 men and wounded 25 more. And then, the next year, the battleship collided with a schooner. This was on July 21st, 1920, and killed 2 of the schooner's crew. Not exactly a great start to Hyūga's career. That said, the 1920s passed pretty quietly as a whole. Hyūga had very little to do beyond train and patrol off the Asian mainland. The only real exceptions were the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923 and a refit in 1927. The former saw Hyūga provide medical support as well as transporting food. The latter was a fairly minor affair, mostly centered on building up her mast. The first steps into what would become the famous pagoda style. Beyond this, nothing much of note occurred. This would mostly hold true for the 1930s as well, with only a handful of incidents worth noting. First, in March 1932, Hyūga joined her sister, and Kongo and Kirishima, in patrolling off the Chinese coast. This was in response to the first Shanghai incident. Then, in June of 1932, the battleship had her next bout of bad luck. During fleet exercises, the submarine I-4 was performing a simulated attack on battleships of the fleet. A failure in communication saw the boat surface right ahead of those battleships. Hyūga, steaming along at 12 knots, swung to the side and barely avoided cutting the submarine in two. She still grazed the side of I-4, causing damage to the boat and Hyūga's own bow. I suppose you could say there was also good luck involved in missing a direct collision. 1933, meanwhile, saw Hyūga fitted with aircraft handling equipment on her stern, as well as improved anti-aircraft weaponry. Her 3-inch guns were replaced by 127mm or 5-inch dual-purpose weapons, 4 twin mounts for a total of 8 barrels. 2 of the 5.5-inch guns were removed at the same time. This was just the first stage of what became a far more extensive rebuild. In line with their predecessors, the Fuso-class, the Ise sisters received a major modernization in the 1930s. This was intended to keep the ships competitive for at least a little while longer. In Hyūga's case, the rebuild began on October 24th, 1934, and it really was a rebuild, not a refit, if not to the same extent as the Italian examples. First, Hyūga's machinery was completely ripped out. Her original 24 boilers were replaced by 8 newer models. Her turbines were, similarly, torn out and replaced by more modern designs. This increased the power to 80,000 shaft horsepower and the speed to around 25 knots. It also saw one of the funnels removed. The stern, meanwhile, was lengthened by 25 feet to help with the speed increase. A longer and leaner hull form improves speed. This was very necessary because the battleship also gained torpedo bulges. That would have slowed her down if not for the increased length and increased power. The deck armor was also improved to a maximum thickness of 6 inches. At the same time, the torpedo tubes were removed and the main battery had its elevation increased. The secondary battery also saw its elevation increased, while 2 more of the guns were removed. This is also when Hyūga began to pick up her first 25mm morale boosters. Finally, the aircraft facilities on the stern were modernized and generally improved. All of this work lasted until September 7th of 1936. It increased the battleship's displacement to 36,000 tons on her standard load. Her weaponry now consisted of the same 12 356mm guns, while the secondary battery had been reduced to 16 140mm weapons. She also carried 8 dual-purpose 127mm guns, as well as 10 twin mounts of the 25mm anti-aircraft weapon. After this refit, the remainder of the 1930s passed much the same as the first half had done: training duties and patrols off the Chinese coast. Beyond that, nothing to write home about, not even when the Pacific War kicked off. Her initial duty in that war was not exactly eventful. After spending 1941 off the coast of Japan, she joined up with the Nagato-class on December 7th, or December 8th, 1941, on the Japanese side of the international dateline. While the carriers attacked Pearl Harbor, the battleship stuck closer to home. In fact, Hyūga would spend the early war hovering around Japan's home waters. While much of the IJN's faster forces were engaging the Allies in the South Pacific or Indian Ocean, Hyūga was either in port or training around Japan. Her next moment of excitement didn't come until mid-1942, specifically the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942. The battleship was sent out to try and chase down Halsey's aircraft carriers after they launched that raid from USS Hornet. As could be expected, this came to nothing. Halsey slipped away, and Hyūga returned home empty-handed, other than accosting a neutral Soviet freighter on the way back. As if that wasn't bad enough for Hyūga, her bad luck struck again a couple weeks later. On May 5th, 1942, the battleship was training, when another explosion rocked one of her turrets, this time turret 5. The left gun breech blew up, which killed 51 of her sailors. After flooding the aft magazines, the battleship returned home for repair work, where it became apparent that the turret was a write-off. It was removed entirely and replaced by a circular armor plate on top of the barbette. Hyūga was now down to 10 guns and 5 turrets. While the battleship would test an early radar prototype in late May of 1942, the rest of the year was largely uneventful. She sailed to cover the Aleutians operation on May 29, 1942. This meant she missed the Battle of Midway on June 4th. That battle, a disaster for the Japanese, would see Ise and Hyūga taken in for another rebuild. A rebuild that is of dubious utility. The title of this video is there for a reason. The Japanese were desperate for replacement flight decks. It was quickly recognized as too time-consuming and expensive to do a full conversion program. Dockyard space and resources just weren't there. So only 2 battleships would get a partial reconstruction. That meant either the 2 Fusos or the 2 Ises. Exactly why they chose the Ises is a bit murky depending on which source you use. It could be because they were slightly faster. It could also be because their sternmost turrets couldn't elevate as high. The most likely answer is Hyūga's damage earlier in the year. Hyūga was already down a stern turret, so there was less work to do to her. And if you were going to convert one of the 2 ships, it made sense to convert the other sister as well. Either way, Hyūga went in for the reconstruction in May of 1943. This saw her remaining stern turret removed and a large flight deck and hangar built up on the stern, complete with a T-shaped aircraft lift. The hangar would hold 9 aircraft, while 11 more were carried on the deck. A further 2 would be carried on the 2 catapults, added at the same time. That would be an air group of 22 aircraft. The intention was to carry a mix of D-4Y dive bombers and E-16A floatplanes, Judies and Pauls respectively. Of course, the flight deck could never land any of those aircraft. It was far too short for the dive bombers. That meant that Hyūga could only recover the floatplanes. The D-4Ys would have to land on a proper carrier or a land base, or alternatively, fly off on a one-way trip. As well as the flight deck, the secondary battery was completely torn out during this rebuild. The old 140mm guns were removed entirely, while the dual-purpose 127mm guns were increased by 4 more twin mounts, raising the total to 8 mounts and 16 barrels, alongside 57 25mm guns. More of those 25mm guns would be added later on, as well as 6 30-tube anti-aircraft rocket launchers in September of 1944. This rebuild was officially completed on November 18, 1943. Upon its completion, the Japanese got a ship that was, honestly, kind of terrible. Hyūga was less worse off than Ise in only losing 1 gun turret. Even so, the battle carriers were pretty bad at either of their roles. They couldn't carry many aircraft, and of those, only half could be recovered. In exchange, they lost 1 or 2 turrets, 1 on Hyūga, 2 on Ise, to gain a massive target on their back. That hangar would be a giant flaming mess in any surface engagement. I'll probably do a video on battle carriers in general at some point. Suffice it to say, for now, that you're getting a battleship with a giant weak spot in surface combat, in exchange for being a kinda terrible attempt at an aircraft carrier. Either way, Hyūga spent the majority of 1944 working up and training. Her air wing would be expended in other duties, and the battle carrier would never use aircraft in actual action. In fact, her only combat duty came in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. On October 25, 1944, Hyūga was part of the Northern Force when it was attacked by American carrier aircraft. Her own role consisted largely of trying, and failing, to cover the Chitose-class carriers. Hyūga could not pull that off, although she avoided damage of her own for the most part. Just some flooding of her torpedo bulge from near misses. Hyūga would safely withdraw from the battle after the proper carriers were sent to the bottom. For the remainder of 1944, the battle carrier was used for transport runs. She carried troops towards the front line, and carried strategic war materials back to Japan. This was hardly glorious duty, but the Japanese needed every transport they could get their hands on. As it was, Hyūga would never see proper combat again. In 1945, she would be relegated to reserve, although the ship did get one final bit of excitement while at sea. The only time Hyūga got to use her guns in anger against a surface target was on February 13, 1945. She fired on a surface submarine, but failed to land any hits before the boat submerged. After this, the old ship returned to Japan. She was docked in Kure and left there without fuel or aircraft. It would be in that location that Hyūga was ultimately sunk after multiple American air attacks. The first came on March 19th and saw 3 hits to the battleship. 37 of her crew were killed and another 52 wounded. After that, she avoided damage for a little while. Ultimately, these attacks would culminate on July 24th with 10 bomb hits. It blew off part of her stern, wrecked her bridge, and set fires across the ship. 200 more men were killed, with 600 wounded. Over the next couple days, Hyūga settled into the bottom, sinking completely on July 26th. The ship was finally abandoned in early August 1945 and left in place. Her wreck remained there after Japan's surrender, before ultimately being scrapped over the course of 1946 and into 1947. Hyūga's career ultimately amounted to very little. It's hard to see her rebuild as anything but a mistake, although it is arguable if she would have done much good as a pure battleship. In all honesty, by the time she could see combat, it was arguably too late for her to do much. Hyūga was simply outdated in the era of the aircraft carrier. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.